You know, every once in a while you meet someone in politics who actually reminds you of why you believe in the system to begin with. Not because they've got the loudest mic or the sharpest elbows in the room, but because they've managed to hang on to something that feels almost rare in modern politics: optimism. And to me, that's Representative Monica Stonier. She represents Washington's 49th legislative district right here in Vancouver. She's been showing up for this community for a long time. She's a teacher and a mother and one of those people who never seems to lose sight of who she's actually fighting for. Monica's the kind of legislator who doesn't chase headlines, she builds coalitions. She's the person you call on when you have a bill that's complicated, messy, and full of moving parts. The kind of policy that needs someone who can see both the fine print and the human story behind it. She's earned a reputation in Olympia for being thoughtful, steady, and let's be honest, these aren't always words you hear thrown around the Capitol these days. What I appreciate most about her, though, is that she brings that educator's heart to her politics. She's listening more than she lectures. She explains things instead of selling them, and she's never forgotten that public service isn't about winning the argument. It's about improving people's lives. So today we're sitting down with one of the most grounded voices in Washington State Legislature, someone who's helping shape what fairness, inclusion, and common sense actually look like in real life. I'm thrilled to have her on the show. Here's my conversation with Representative Monica Stonier. All right, with that, I'd love to welcome Representative Monica Stonier. Been trying to get you on the show. I'm super excited to have you here. What have you been up to since the last session wrapped?
Yeah, I think we left session kind of trying to anticipate what we were going to see come as a result of federal action this year, and we've not been disappointed. We've had lots to think about and plan around. So we're preparing for another tough legislative session for our state budget, but the impacts that the feds will have on that have been kind of hard to follow. A little game of whiplash where a claim will be made or a threat will be made and then it doesn't really materialize. Or in some cases it really does for Washingtonians. So we've had a number of internal briefings about how federal action is impacting people in our state so that we have good context for when we get to session in January. So I'd say the interim has been about kind of sense making from federal action and preparing our folks here in Washington for anticipating what we can do to help protect people, but also what our limitations may be.
Right. It was a fairly contentious session this last time, I would say, especially around the budgeting items. And now with a lot of federal funds hanging out in the whims and not knowing what's going to happen with those, obviously that's going to create some budgeting shortfalls even further. Where do you guys think you can, try to right that ship or balance that out some?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to be really challenged this year in times where we had maybe some state revenues where we could backfill things that the feds were not taking responsibility for. We were in a position to be more helpful to Washingtonians. We're facing another tough budget year. The state is subject to economic pressures just like everyone else, whether it's a small business or a school district or a household or a large corporation in our state. Inflation hits the state budget just the same. And, that means the cost of transportation projects has gone up. We're seeing increases in costs of doing business as a result of that at the state level. So that puts us in a little bit of a tough position to be able to respond to federal action. I guess a really good example is in the past, we've had folks who maybe didn't qualify for Medicaid at the federal level, but the state chose to include them. These are things like dental coverage for adults. It includes things like an expansion of health care for some of our population in Washington state who have been negatively impacted by federal war activities like our COFA nations and our Chuukese community. And we've expanded our coverage to include those folks. We're just not going to be in a position to take that kind of action with our state budget where it's at, and then the huge changes that the federal government is making in people's ability to qualify for programs like housing, food assistance, healthcare.
Right. So, I mean, that makes it very difficult to find that money, right? This stuff costs money, and I mean, it continues to be like, where do we get more money from? I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I also I find it difficult. You know, we talk a lot about healthcare, but a lot of times what we're really talking about is health insurance. I think we should really start leading with healthcare at the forefront because right now, you know, how much you make or don't make or what your job is really determines what kind of health care you get because it determines what kind of health insurance you get. So I hope we continue as a nation and a state to move that needle forward on getting everybody health care and we can start pushing away from you know the talk being around insurance,
Yeah,
which I think is dictates a lot of our talk.
I think you're right about that, Ben. And I would just add that access is another stool in that three leg stool, because regardless of your insurance and regardless of the cost of care, if you don't have access to a provider, that's also driven by those other pressures in the healthcare system, then it doesn't really matter, right? We have, reportedly one provider who can provide a C-section in the northeast corner of this entire state. We have people who cannot access prenatal care in Southwest Washington, even though we have a robust hospital system here, arguably. And then if we think about, the cuts in Medicaid and other areas that we're going to see from the federal government, we're hearing all across the country that rural healthcare is going to be less accessible. So, I mean, we can't talk about one without the other and without the other.
Right. And I think a lot of people forget, or maybe they don't forget, they just don't know or don't want to realize that, you know, in the United States, we have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. We lead the world actually among first world nations, which I think is a real shame given how wealthy our country claims to be. And
Yeah.
we can't even take care of, you know, one of the most simplest pieces of that puzzle, which is taking care of, you know, mother and infant, you know, through their years. But I don't. That could be a whole podcast in itself, I think.
I know. In Olympia, we call that the primary care crisis. If folks aren't accessing primary care for preventative measures, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what their tax bracket is, it actually ends up costing the state so much more in the long run. So having an opportunity to access prenatal care and primary care, yeah, really important, but it should be kind of universally available for folks.
You know, on a more personal level, how do you switch gears from policymaker to coming back down, you know, to the area and being teacher and mom and those things? Do you find that transition difficult?
No. I think what is difficult is the transition from, not the transition to. So, transitioning from home is a bit harder because, you're kind of used to being in the regular operations of the household on the regular phone call, and talking about, changing cat litter and grocery shopping, things like that. And so when you leave home, I think it certainly creates a gap at home and also a sense of maybe a loss of connectivity when I'm away in Olympia. But that, Olympia is just so incredibly busy that there's not really a whole lot of time to wallow in that, which is why I'm so appreciative and I would say encouraging of families who support their lawmakers to be in Olympia, because I know we leave a lot behind that needs to be filled in other ways. I have to say, transitioning home from Olympia is smooth as butter. There's just nothing like coming home and getting back to the stuff that you really want to be working on because you've missed it a bit. So, there's maybe a little bit of a stall getting back to work because I have to get caught up on projects that I haven't been involved in or talking about. But it's a nice soft landing and it doesn't take long. There's so much to do in schools that it doesn't take long for that work to find its way straight to your desk.
What's the most surprising thing do you think that people find out about day-to-day life as a state legislator?
I think that the thing that people are most surprised about is just like lawmakers are normal people. I even had a couple of folks mention just this last week, that like, oh, you're just like here in town. And yeah, I was at Safeway, I was working in my yard. The neighbor comes out and is like, hey, we haven't seen you in a while. I think that's maybe a little bit surprising to people. I think the congressional level, the federal level of elected officials who are in and out of Washington, D.C. and have a much bigger kind of scale of that work is what most people think about. But for those of us who are in a part-time legislature, we're doing just as much of our everyday life business as we are in the legislature, because it's not a full-time job. So yeah, when I run into people at the hardware store because I'm picking up plants that I need to get planted in the garden, or if those plants stay out longer than they're supposed to so they don't survive and then I got to go back, these are just things that I think normal people deal with. And I think folks are often surprised to find out that we're not like flying in and out of town all the time with a perceived wardrobe budget, which is something people think we have, and a driver. So I think people are a little bit interested and intrigued to find out that state lawmakers are a bit more normal and accessible than they anticipate.
Right. And I think in this day and age, right, where we have social media is so prevalent, and people feel like maybe politicians are not human beings sometimes, right? Like we
Yeah.
have lives and family and those type of things, and words and actions do we feel those things, right? I mean, you just can't say whatever you want, or
Yeah.
people feel like they can say whatever they want. How do you, in this supercharged political environment that we've found ourselves in of late, how do you deal with kind of those day-to-day pieces where, you're just reading an article online and you look down at the comments and there's, oh, somebody just blasting you for, whatever, name it, why they're, how do you deal with that balance?
Yeah, I mean, recently there's a lot of chatter about me in the far right kind of comments on some stuff, and I think what I try to do is figure out what's the fastest way to ignoring what doesn't matter. People who really do want to engage with me, ask questions about a policy, or be a meaningful contributor to something that they oppose, I never have a hard time meeting with those folks. I've had, some people kind of be concerned about my willingness sometimes to meet with people that are strongly opposed on some issues and express, in terms that are a bit aggressive. But ultimately, when I meet with people, the temperature comes down super quick. It doesn't take long to find common ground. And it's important for me to remember those times, because when I do get agitated and supercharged about things, I have to remember that there are more reasons to be hopeful about people solving problems together than what we see in the bigger headlines. And so my experience just hasn't been that people operate on that like crazy far end realm. My experience has been that reasonable people, even sometimes unreasonable people, can have reasonable conversations and walk away without having changed minds, but having heard a different perspective, and not feel disrespected in that conversation. So as long as that keeps happening more times than it doesn't, I think I'll have an easier time just ignoring the things I don't really think are going to have a huge impact either on my opinion, their opinion, or any policy outcomes.
Sure. I guess with that in mind, that's a good segue here to talk about, what's been fairly controversial and is still making waves is, the student rights bill,
Oh yeah.
right? Um, I guess let's start with that bill a little bit, right? 1296, I think, is House Bill 1296.
Mhm.
You were a big pusher of that. I think you were the lead sponsor of that bill, if I'm not mistaken. What was the core problem you were trying to solve with that bill?
Yeah, so in the session before, the far right put forward six initiatives to the legislature. And those are different from initiatives to the people. Initiatives to the people go to a ballot for people to decide if they collect enough signatures. An initiative to the legislature goes to the legislature to consider. And so three of those we just passed as they were because we didn't feel that there was a whole lot of room for us. They might be longer term goals for us, but We just we weren't dealing with those issues right up front, and so we went ahead and passed those. Three of them we had to consider in the legislature. You have three choices. You can do nothing, you can pass them as they come to you, or you can offer an alternative, and then the alternative goes to the two alternatives go to the voters for an option.
I got you. So just to clarify for listeners, how did those come to you? They had to collect X amount of
Right.
signatures on these initiatives, and then they come right to the house floor, or how does that
Yeah,
work?
great question. So if they collect enough signatures by the end of the year, so it'll be, the end of December here, for this year, but in the past, same situation. They go through the same process of signature verification by the Secretary of State, and if they pass that assessment, then they come to the legislature for consideration. They show up in both chambers, and in some cases, well, I think in all three cases, we held joint committee hearings about them. So the committees that they got referred to, the House and the Senate would meet together, which is unconventional. The initiatives don't have to follow the same path; they just have to pass the legislature writ large. So we can hold committees together for them. And the timelines are not consistent with other bill timelines. We don't have to stick to the House of Origin cutoff deadlines that we adopt. They can move through the process at their own pace, which afforded us a lot of time to consider what we should do with them. One of those was the Parental Bill of Rights. The Parental Bill of Rights was written in a way that most parents would assume that those rights are rights that they should hold. And I don't disagree. I agree that the rights that were listed in that initiative were rights that parents should hold. There was one point that was incredibly confusing and misleading for the public, and that was around medical records for young children. So the initiative proposed a concept that schools could not perform or provide access to medical services without parental awareness, and that those medical records that are collected ought to be available to parents if they were collected in schools. That's already settled in statute, but it created some confusion about what is and is not available to parents and whether or not parents can have access to certain records. So it was very in the weeds. It was very much driven by this kind of sentiment to disrupt public trust in public schools. There was a lot of rhetoric around terrible things teachers do and terrible things about the public school system, and most of it rooted in misinformation or intentionally distributed disinformation.
What do you think people are getting wrong about that bill?
Yeah, so
What
I
was
think what
the
people misunderstood about that initiative was that it changed what kinds of records parents would have access to when it really didn't. So the bill that I wrote in response to that, we passed the initiative because we asked over and over, does this change the law around medical records or around academic records? And the answer by attorneys all across the board were no, 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 no. So we passed it. What happened as a result of that was confusion continued. Schools were unsure how to kind of comply with this new initiative, and so we needed to provide some clarity. Now, my approach in writing 1296 was to change the conversation to include broader rights. So that's why it's called the Students' Rights Bill. We kept the parental rights that were previously standing. I expanded those rights to also include parents of students with special needs in school and immigrant families. So those were families that the initial far right version left out. So those parents get included in the policy. And then I also include a student's right to an inclusive school environment, one without bullying and harassment, one that doesn't discriminate against a student however they come to school, that those students have access to a historically accurate history curriculum. So we're not taking away parts of history as we see happening in other states, that students have a right to scientifically accurate curriculum so that their sexual health, science, math, you know, language arts curriculum are all backed by science and best practice. And then thirdly includes a teacher's right to protect students' access to those rights. So if I see that as a teacher, if I see that a student's right to participate in school activities without discrimination is being violated, I have a right as a teacher to stand up for that student without risking retaliation. So we just kind of took this parental rights concept, expanded it, included students, included educators, and others who work in the school system. And now the far right has decided that they're going to work to pass another initiative to the legislature to try and repeal 1296.
Right. And so what is it about it that they're trying to repeal? So if I'm walking out of the grocery store and
Mm-hmm.
they're out there trying to collect signatures for this, what are they telling me as a citizen that's going to make me want to say yes or no, I'll sign this piece?
Yeah.
What is it? What is their angle, I
What they're
guess?
going to tell you is that 1296 erased all of the parental rights when in actuality it expanded it. And so what they don't like is the inclusive nature of including students having their own individual rights, because they feel that drives, they comment that drives a wedge in the family by identifying students as they have their own rights separate from parents having their own rights, which is funny to me because those rights exist in every other part of the statute. So the fact that they want to have this fight in public school setting is just really about Project 2025, disrupting, community support for public schools, wanting to protect a school district's ability to have, policies in place that allow discrimination against our LGBTQ youth, or to choose curriculum that's not historically accurate. If they would just be more overt about that being their real intent, I think folks would probably make a decision on this kind of thing pretty quickly.
Sure. It's interesting when you start listening and reading about the for and against on different initiatives and bills. And, there's always like a real nitpick out of these to really kind of pull a thread that a lot of times making issues where there is no
Mm-hmm.
issue. I think one of the things I've heard most about this, and maybe you can kind of expand on this piece, is that it takes away, it allows the school system to not tell the parents things and keep things from the parents.
Right.
Is that's something I hear quite a bit of. Do you feel like 1296 facilitates that in any way?
I guess I'll just point back to one of the pieces of testimony I heard in the Senate committee on this bill. One of the testifiers who opposed the bill came forward with their concern that teachers can take students out of school, take them to get a medical procedure, and then they commented that that could be an abortion or gender affirming care, and the parents would never know, which is absolutely not true. We stopped the hearing, or we didn't. The Senate chair stopped the hearing, went to the attorney to say, please read this, or the nonpartisan legal staff to read the statute that clearly defines how inaccurate that claim was. And so, these are the kinds of things or stories that people are telling or telling themselves about things that happen in school that we can't do. Like, a teacher can't check a student out of school. That's not even a thing we can legally do. Medical records around those types of procedures are not created in school settings. We have nothing to do with that law or that area of statute, right? So these fictional stories about what could be happening are, I think, what as a parent, I would also be fearful if that were true. I get it. It
Right.
stokes fear for good reason. Protective, loving parents are going to be concerned about that, and I don't blame them. It's just the problem is that it's just simply not true, and causes concern.
Right. It seems there's some fear mongering around that issue, right? As parents, right? I have 3 children. I wouldn't want anybody to be able to check my child out of school and take them anywhere to do anything.
Right.
much less a medical procedure. And I think it's pretty clear that the student rights bill makes no way, shape, or form that permissible under any circumstance. From what I've read the bill.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I can read English,
Yeah.
so we got that.
Yeah, my hope is more people will see it that way and decline to sign the initiatives because, we're just we just started this podcast, Ben, talking about healthcare issues and other things that directly impact people's lives, their ability to pay the bills, thrive, and be healthy. And nobody can learn without those things taken care of first. So the fact that we spend so much time talking about these things that are not real problems in our school settings is incredibly frustrating to me, and I grow more and more offended by it. I think I mentioned that on the House floor when we were debating this bill, how offended I was that I have to once again stand to defend my profession and my colleagues as if we were to be villainized as causing harm to children.
Right. What is it? Do you feel like this movement is to sow distrust in the public school setting? Where is this coming from?
Well, I mean, I think the Trump administration is putting in play many of the things that we have seen come from the far right in the past. Distrust of government altogether, dismantling of public education, causing question and concern where scientists and experts can be the lead rather than politicians. We saw that in the dismantling of the Department of Education. We see that when JFK Jr. pretends to know more about science and vaccines and causes of illnesses than he knows, and then to put that in play in our public health sphere. We see that when it comes to this administration's willingness to completely ignore the human and constitutional rights of people who are living in this country because they politically find that their opposition now has power to take those rights away from people. And we're getting a chance to see people stand up against that right now. And we see it when I think this is one concern that I really have is this ignoring of the separation of church and state in this nation, where like the sender of all of the policies that will change and save America come from a religious grounding or a religious belief that may not be held by all people in this country. And we have a right to have a separation there that is not being held up by this administration. So these are all kind of far right policies and sentiments that we've seen for decades, forever. And I just am concerned that we have a president now that's putting those in play. And so that's where I think it's coming from.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's about building trust, not just amongst, it's constituents, trust for, elected officials. It's trusting in the folks that we count on doing, educating our children, those things. Can we build this trust back? How do we build bridges to bring trust back with the public, elected officials, public education? How do we bridge that gap and, bring people back to saying, let's have real conversations about real things that are happening and how can we improve on, X, Y, Z?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is just remember that we're not getting anywhere with the approach that we're taking right now, which is to yell at each other and lecture each other about why the other person is wrong. Asking a question with a true seeking to understand kind of core value is going to be very difficult. I'm finding it more and more difficult, but it's also more and more important as time goes on. I have a term that I use a lot called predatory listening. which is when somebody listens to what you're saying in an effort to try and find the place where they can attack next. Like, I know when I have a predatory listener in front of me, they're not letting me finish my sentence. They're not asking me follow-up questions. They're not really trying to understand where I'm coming from. They're looking for what I'm about to say that they can attack next. And we've just got to stop doing that to each other. Like, if we're not willing to have a real conversation about the part that we can agree on, or at least have common understanding of the problem, even if we don't agree on the solution, then we're not gonna get anywhere. It's not working. Like, we are falling apart because it's not working right now. So
Right.
I think there's role and function for people who are going to be the loudest and most aggressive, but that's not where work is going to get done.
I think that's a big part of it, right? I think, and I know I've talked about this quite a bit. Is just finding that common ground, and it doesn't necessarily mean moving off of your values or your principles. For myself, I think it starts with being human, and I consider myself a human rights advocate. It's not any group. I mean,
Yeah.
we're all humans, right? We're flesh and bones, and if you strip away, outward coatings, we all look the same.
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel like I have given on my values, my core beliefs around humanity, human rights, access to education and healthcare, and justice, democracy. I don't feel like I've given on those things, but I also feel that I've gained a reputation for working across the aisle, for being reasonable, for finding solutions that more people can agree on, and not necessarily all, because we're not going to always get there. I think, there are ways to go about doing it. I can't do it in every area. I mean, there certainly are areas where I get fiery and pissed and I'm, less reasonable, no question. But we're all going to have those. It's where you can work, where you can give grace, and where you can listen intentionally, where we'll have to, I mean, even if I have to meditate first before I go to that spot, I will do that.
Sure. I mean, I think that's fair, right? That's part of the human condition. That's part of who we are, and I think I had somebody ask me the other day. Um, they said, what's your version of common sense, Ben? You talk about common sense a lot. Your campaign platform is common sense, and so I had to think about what is my definition of common sense. What does common sense leadership look like to me? And when I thought about it, and the way I lead is with integrity, transparency, and trying to do the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And so when I'm leading or making decisions on common sense, to me, that's what common sense is. Common sense isn't universal because it's shaped on our life experiences and our views and our values. And so, I think when we use the term, I think we probably should define it
Yeah.
for what your version of common sense is. Because if your version of common sense, is I want to do, just for my circle of people, I want them to do well. I mean, that's not very common to me. I think that's, a very selfish view instead of looking at the world in a broader perspective.
Yeah. I think we have a lot of legislators who get elected that come with that understanding, and then others that come with a need to learn that perspective. You get elected by a legislative district that may be very different from many other parts of the state, and you have an obligation to represent your community in your district. But ultimately, you're going to be voting on bills that are implemented across the state. So they kind of have to do both. They kind of have to serve your community, and but not solely, not in a way that gets in the way of serving the rest of the state. It's a state policy. It's not a city council level or a county level decision. It's for, OMAC and, North Seattle and South Seattle and Spokane and Ellensburg and Centerville. Um,
Right.
you know,
Right. And I think that's the point, right? Is that it becomes necessary to come back and talk to your constituents through being in your district, through having town halls, putting out information so that they can see clearly what your decision making process was, the stakeholders that you spoke with, and thinking of the greater good. I'd like to touch a little bit on 1669 Prosthetics and Orthotics Coverage Bill. I think as a veteran, um, I think this bill, it spoke to me a little bit because we're talking about taking care of people who have lost limbs, and not just in the function of, you know, you get this one limb and then that's it. And it goes back to what we were talking about when we opened the podcast, I feel like, is that, you know, we're not talking, this is health care for folks who need coverage, as opposed to, do you have the health insurance you need that's going to give you, a limb that's going to be functional? Can you tell us a little bit about what your motivation was for being a champion of this bill?
Yeah. So there's this woman, Nicole Verkulen, who lives here in Vancouver, who I met last year. And I was unaware that she had been running this like nationwide coalition and advocacy team to make sure that people who have lost a limb or have other physical challenges that may decrease their ability to use their limbs fully could have access to a prosthetic that allows them full mobility. So, you might have coverage that provides you a walking leg, but she's a triathlete and her mental health and physical health was dependent on her having a running blade. And we have 3-year-olds who are without a limb and may get a walking leg from their insurance, but I don't know. I know that you have children and I have children and I've seen a lot of children, and very few 3-year-olds only walk and not run. So I feel like, we,
I have a 4-year-old, and she likes to do about everything but walk. Skip, jump backwards, jump up and down.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I've met her and she's lovely and she's funny and she is, yes, running around all the time. And I don't know how a 3-year-old with only one limb can be as healthy and living their full life the way she is without the ability to do so physically. So I brought a show and tell for you. I guess it was September. I was in Orlando working with the So Everybody Can Move Coalition, which is the coalition working on passing this bill across the country. And they gave me this piece of art that they commissioned, which is, this is a person that kind of represents the way you might imagine Nicole, and this one is about as equally representative of how I might show up in a cartoon. But it was a very touching award to get from that coalition for having passed the bill in Washington State. We have to come back and do more later when the state budget can provide for it, because we only did it in the private plans and not the public plans. But we felt it was important to make movement on, no pun intended, on the bill in this state so that we can come back later and have a better, stronger foundation to start from. So I'm really, really proud of that. I mean, the people that came to testify and to share their stories spent a lot of time talking with me about just kind of their mental health and ability to be able to participate in their communities fully. And at the state level, we've done this for things like hearing aids, like kids come and talk about how they can't hear their soccer coach and how compelling of an argument that was, that they are not able to participate as a youth, or a grandparent not being able to hear the song on a guitar that was just written for them by their grandchild because they don't have access to that kind of coverage, and the impact that has on your mental health. So if we're going to think about people in their health broadly, we can't be thinking about it in isolated body parts.
1,000%. What was the pushback you got? What was the pushback you got from insurers on this?
Yeah, so so this is a remarkable story to tell you. There was very little pushback because the population of people who are missing a limb is so small that they couldn't make the case that it was going to have a huge impact on premiums in the plans. So there wasn't a lot of pushback. I imagine there would be pushback if the bill was bigger and was going to cost more for the state. We may have seen some opposition there, But I think that what the best story about this bill, we just got done talking about another bill that I worked on this year with a lot of opposition in Olympia and outside of Olympia. But this bill was supported bipartisanly, and Republicans were happy to sign on to it. My friend Senator Paul Harris, a Republican in the state Senate, introduced the Senate companion bill, and we worked on it together. So this is an example of like a thing that we could do where everyone agreed. There's a small step we can take here that's good for people who live in this state, and when we can do more, we will do more. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of pushback. Most of the bills around mandated coverage that I carry, like I have one that I've been working on for years to mandate biomarker coverage, another one to mandate IVF coverage. Those are, those can have an impact on premiums, and those run into bigger opposition.
What? So what do you think this says about Washington State and our ability to be front runners in providing health care for Washingtonians? And why do you think I try to figure out, and I do, and I think I talk to a lot of people, and I work in healthcare, and so I think I'm just baffled. I think about 75% of the people I chat with, and probably I think that's what the nationwide number is, says that we should have some type of universal health care for every American. I think people fail to realize that these insurance companies make billions and billions of dollars of profit, and that profit comes directly from denying care to the people they're supposed to be covering. How do we as a state continue to be on the front, the pointy end, making sure that we can keep driving this health care for all Washingtonians?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Washington, we've tried to kind of take small steps along that path where we can. And, I don't blame my constituents or people across the state or the nation being frustrated with not making faster progress on, a universal healthcare concept. But we have Cascade Care in this state, which was an expansion of the Affordable Care Act, a Washington version that just kind of captures more people in coverage. We try to make sure that when an insurance plan says that they cover a certain procedure or service, that it's one that can actually be accessed by the people in their plan. And so we've continued to take some small steps in that direction, but the bigger part is accountability for that, how we monitor for that, and how we stay focused on what are the challenges in the progress. So there's no question that insurance plans are going to protect their ability to keep what they would argue their costs down for their customers, which weirdly has the same impact as keeping their profits as high as possible. But so I feel like we have to get better about what that transparency looks like, and where pharmaceutical and contracts that plans have with pharmaceutical companies have an interplay. We've passed some bills and some policy around that kind of transparency, one that I introduced years ago, and we passed a smaller version of it recently, that gives kind of benefit managers some oversight and accountability for the kinds of decisions that the benefit manager is making over the provider or the patient.
Right. So what do you feel is the biggest holdup? Like, where does that lie when we're talking about, going to a universal health care? Is it just the use of the name universal health care? Yeah. What
I think
what is
that
it? I think everybody wants health care, and I think everybody agrees that every American deserves to have health care, but for some reason it becomes controversial when you start talking about it. And I think if I told you, hey Monica, I got a bill, and we're gonna take, it's gonna cost you $200 a month, for every citizen of Washington, and you get this excellent healthcare package. I don't think there's a citizen out there that would say that's a bad idea. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out. I think how do we make everybody get on board with, I think because everybody's scared of a new tax, right? But I think the other side of that is if you could pay X amount but not have to pay for your own healthcare premium, and your business wouldn't have to cover part of the premium either, and that was just it. Like, that's costing you considerably less money.
Yeah, so I think we talked a little bit about this already. One of those things is, you know, not being a predatory listener and seeking to understand. So when you and I talk about where we may agree or disagree on healthcare costs and universal healthcare progress, if I'm turned off by the term universal healthcare, we probably could have a conversation and agree that, you know, setting a broken arm in this country is one cost, and doing that and writing a check for $25 to another healthcare provider in a different country to get the care that you need, and maybe there's some insurance plan there or not, but you know, like there's just, we can agree that that seems unfair in one of, you know, the greatest nations when it comes to, you know, medical advancements and research, right? Like that seems crazy, and I think we all could agree on that. But I think what we're challenged with, kind of on the nerdy technical side of this, is when we have states that have different plans, and when you have companies will make this argument all the time when they have to deal with mandates or laws in a patchwork fashion in all of these different states, their ability to kind of manage that is harder and harder. I don't disagree with that. I just think it's a poor excuse when it comes to the consequence Washingtonians and Americans have to pay when it comes to the cost of healthcare.
Right.
And we also can't talk about things in Olympia in terms of a dynamic fiscal note. So we can't talk about the cost savings to the state of having a better plan. We can only talk about the cost to the state to implement the plan. So it takes conversations like this where we can say, well, let's just take a look at the budget and see how much we're paying for with our own tax dollars that you and I both pay to the state to take care of people who would not be in the situation they're currently in if they had access to primary care and cheaper medicines. Like, if we could just talk about that more, I think we'd make a whole lot more progress on the middle ground. But unfortunately, you know, the sentiment and the rhetoric from those that make a lot of money on slowing this process down and keeping it high cost have a lot of power to disrupt that conversation.
Right. And we could talk about this, could be multiple series podcast. And I'll leave this on this note before we move on to the next subject matter. But I would say we're the only first world country in the world that doesn't have a form of universal health care for its citizens. So I'll just leave that at that. I think as the greatest nation in the world, and I think we are the greatest nation in the world, and I'll scream that from the rooftops. But
Yeah.
doesn't mean we don't have a lot of room to do a lot better for the citizens of this country.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think we are the greatest because we've allowed for ingenuity, for, you know, entrepreneurialism in ways that, you know, you're not going to find in other places. And, you know, a free market has its own pressures. But we also have seen from financial institutions that completely unregulating or ignoring places where our citizens are not best served by that market, we end up in a world of hurt. And so a balance is necessary, and that's true for most things, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that brings us to something I wanted to chat a little bit about is the bottle bill, right? The beverage container refund program has created quite a stir, and I could see why it has. I've kind of read up and heard both sides of the argument, and I can see where both sides are coming from. I know you've been working on it, and it hasn't quite come to fruition as it's written. What do you think's been such a hard lift for this particular bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, change is hard. Like that I get it. Change is hard. And I think the idea of a deposit that we would pay on a container is a harder starting point than when we actually talk about the refund. If you talk to anybody who lives in a refund state, like all of the other ones on this coast and Michigan and other places, you'll talk to lots of people who have benefited from not just like getting their own refunds back on beverage containers, but fundraising efforts, being able to contribute to your favorite nonprofit, to your school PTA, your local humane society, things like that, where there's so much infrastructure capacity to contribute to other organizations. Most people who live in states that have a refund program already know and understand that. In fact, my friend June Robinson, who's the state senator who has the Senate version of the bill, said that to me initially. She was like, I cannot believe we're still not doing this. This is so, why? And so I think that's part of it, is just kind of imagining for many people how this would operate if they haven't experienced it before, is kind of a tough thing. But I will say,
Well, do you think it's because a lot of people just see the deposit as another tax on folks, right? I mean, some might argue that, a bottle deposit on is could just what it amounts to is just another tax, and it will disproportionately affect those that are lower income folk.
yeah, so I love that question. This morning I got a briefing on some polling we got back from the state, from people across the state in all corners of the state. And yes, that is a concern that people have, that it feels like a tax. Um, but more people know what a refund is. And that's, and more people know what a refund program looks like. And more people care about making sure our waterways are free of plastic pollutions. And more people care about whether or not we have a local industry and manufacturing cycle for aluminum cans and glass and plastics that we would use for beverage containers. And the people who care about those things are people who have to pay for them in manufacturing. So you're talking about the brands like Red Bull, who who know that if they could just keep using the same like aluminum sheet over and over again to make their cans, that's going to reduce costs and leave them less subject to the impacts of, let's say, tariffs, for example.
Sure.
So you're going to find that more people know that this is that the litter problem we have, that could be solved and greatly reduced by a refund program, is harming our farms and our fishing industry. Like, these are, more people know about all of those things related to containers kind of just laying around our state than care about whether or not this is perceived as a tax, because they understand deposit refund.
Right. So I
The
guess
undecideds are so incredibly low in this poll that I was surprised to see. Usually I see a lot of polling. Undecided means I don't know, or I don't know enough about it, or I don't trust my own judgment because I haven't made my own decision yet. It is so significantly lower than any other undecided, and it doesn't change over the messaging battery, which means that people understand this.
I mean, this has come along before, right? We've had this up for vote on the ballot statewide, and obviously it didn't pass. For what reason do you think it hasn't passed on a ballot like that?
Yeah, so at the time when this was on the ballot, it was also at the time that we were debating a litter tax, and the state went with a litter tax over a refund program. And so I think we're talking about a different time and a different conversation in our state, both relative to taxation, because the litter tax is now in place, and also relative to, like, what is it that we know we can do to benefit the environment with a refund program. So the other situation that is now different in this state is we have recycling goals we have to meet, statutorily, like legally, that we will not meet without the passage of a refund program, which means the cost of doing business will be higher as a result of that. So we have environmental standards that we are required to meet. And so I feel like that wasn't in place back then. We hadn't seen all of the different ways that we can better the program like we have now. Washington is uniquely situated to make some improvements to some of the other, like maybe challenges people have with other refund programs in different states, because we've learned from them, and our coalition is, filled with businesses that operate in many states.
I guess with that in mind, it would take is there some infrastructure that needs to come along with this bill? And these stakeholders, so the beverage manufacturers and those folks who use these containers, is there any investment coming from them, or
Yeah,
is this just going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in fact, this is another example of why the timing is important and different now than it was before. Last year, the legislature passed a producer responsibility bill, so there's already going to be infrastructure underway as a result of the passage of that bill to have cleaner products produced and sold in this state, so that the contribution to the litter problem is slowed. That operation and that infrastructure can coexist with a refund program, and should, because it'll be a lot less to run, it'll be more convenient for consumers, and the outcomes environmentally will be far improved. And so it doesn't make sense to me to delay doing something like this and getting that infrastructure up and running when they should coexist and be more efficient. So your question about infrastructure is a really good one, because we're at a time where, should we pass a refund program now, those beverage containers will be incorporated more quickly in that system.
Yeah, and so I guess, if this were to pass, what would you feel the impact would be, and say just a couple years down the road? How would that impact, do you think, environmentally, income to the state? Right, not everything's going to be recycled, obviously,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
much
So
as we
the
want.
the unrecovered deposits are actually, in my bill legislated that the legislation requires that be used to better the program and make it more accessible to people who are having a hard time accessing it. So if you live in a community where you don't have as easy access to a return center or a drop site, the unrecovered deposits go to making sure that those communities get access to the refund program. So that's one benefit I think that we have in the bill. But down the road, I would say, like, first and foremost, number one, you would see far less litter on the sides of the roads and in the gutters and laying around after a picnic or a barbecue at a park. Because even if somebody doesn't want to clean up after themselves, some kid's going to come around with a green bag, load that stuff up, and get himself or herself an allowance or some spending money or some new shoes or whatever it is they choose to do.
I did that when I was a kid. I went down and collected aluminum, and I think I was doing that when I was in like third, fourth grade. I was trying to make my own money. I was an entrepreneur out there, just collecting cans and turning
And
them in.
I'm sure young Ben learned lots of lessons about kind of sticking to a schedule to get that turned around, and all kinds of skills that would have been beneficial later on. And
Sure.
you're like, everybody I talk to says, oh yeah, I know somebody who, tells me their story about how they got money for their first bike or was able to raise, new uniforms for the football team or whatever, because they went around and collected containers.
Totally. Is there any talk about including waste management in some type of collection system? Well, they're already out collecting anyway. Obviously we recycle, but is there a way to incorporate, the deposit return into waste management? Because they're collecting most everybody except for super rural areas. Obviously, doesn't have collection pickup, but as a good majority, a large percentage, they'd get services.
Yeah, so we believe that, curbside can exist alongside the implementation of a refund program. We've kind of worked through that modeling, and that is quite possible. It's our goal to do that. I mean, I think where you already have infrastructure collecting containers, they ought to be working together to recover that material and reuse or recycle it. There's lots
Right.
of ways to handle aluminum, but the thing with glass, I mean, if you think about, like, I don't know about you, but if I'm carrying, a box of glass bottles of my favorite IPA, or wine from my picked up my allotment from my favorite tasting room. The weight of that product is so heavy because of the container, and there's not very many winemakers who are going to switch from their high quality wine from glass to another material. So folks that are spending a lot of money on glass are realizing how much of their bottom line can be improved by reusing those containers. And so we've seen models for that. We know that we can do it better now in Washington State. So your winemakers and your brewers may be able to provide their product and bring their costs down. So there's just so many different angles on this one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll be interested to see kind of what happens with it as we follow it. It's always interesting to hear both sides of the story, and when you got something that seems could be a positive plus, there's always going to be loud noise from both sides on extreme nature. I think it's important to work through cutting through that noise so that we're listening to the folks, the mass majority of folks, and that goes back to having that common sense leadership, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to be clear, my friend in the 17th, Kevin Waters, I think was number 2 on this bill. So it was introduced at one point in time as a bipartisan bill. And his story for me was that, he owns his family owns the Backwoods Brewery, right? So he's got these cans of beer that he takes a lot of pride in, and should. It's good stuff.
It
And
is good beer.
yeah, and finds himself incredibly frustrated when he's out in the woods on a trail, or out in the community, and sees his own cans on the ground somewhere, and feels like, if this was, that we should have solutions for this, where everybody has a part in helping to clean up the litter problems we have around the state. And the litter issue, like, that's bipartisan, right? Like,
Yeah.
we passed a Senate Republican bill last year. There's lots of support bipartisan wise to help solve the litter issue. So I think, when those things are worth something to someone, they're going to be recovered in a way that is going to be far faster than the millions of dollars we spend on cleanup costs already out of our tax dollars.
Sure, absolutely. And I think if you've ever done any roadside picking up, you're going to find that you find a lot of beer cans and bottles, a lot of fast food packages, and cigarette packs. I think that's what you find the most of. That's probably 80% of roadside garbage are those 3 items. So it's always interested to me. Um,
And I will say
so
that most of the people who talk to me about this bill are people who do freeway cleanup.
if you've ever done any, you know what's out there.
Yeah.
I mean, you find some weird stuff out there on the interstate when you're doing cleanup, but I'm amazed at some of the things I've drug out of a ditch before and think, how did this ever make it? What? How? It's interesting. So, outside of some of the kind of headline bills, that we've discussed, and what are some others you're most proud of from this last session that maybe just kind of floated underneath the radar, and probably rightfully so? If it floated underneath the radar, it's probably because it really had bipartisan support. There probably wasn't a huge action group against it. But is there one piece of legislation you can think of that you're like, I was really proud that we worked together to move this along?
Whew, that's a good question. I don't think I thought about that one. Sometimes there's bills that you don't really know are important until you learn more about them. I would say for me, rent stabilization is one that wasn't a sneaker. That was definitely a loud one.
Sure.
But it was definitely one that I didn't quite understand all of the pressures on our housing market until I started learning about the increases in rent that happen without warning, not on a schedule, and in some cases far higher than the cost of upkeep for a property. So I think that was one that helped me learn a lot. I don't know. I kind of feel like I need to go back and look at our.
No, I think that's a good one. I think you're right. That one didn't really fall under the radar so much, and it's controversial in itself because obviously now we're saying, oh well, it's you know this percentage, and now people are just gonna raise it that much every year, whether they need it or not, and there's that whole piece to it. But I think doing nothing for affordable housing and those things is far worse than speculating the worst case scenario of people's humanity. So I
Yeah. You
like
know,
to have a little.
I'll say that another thing I've learned about that I think is really important for us to consider continuing our work on is our tourism in this state. So the hospitality industry has gathered together to create their own that they'll pay into their own I guess program to increase tourism marketing for Washington State because they will directly benefit from that. And I think that is the kind of example of where the business community here and across the state recognize that they would benefit from this one financial tool that the state can offer them or can authorize for them that helps build their own company and outreach. And they come with the solution, right? Like they come with like, hey, we will pay into this because we know we'll more than benefit from that. And I think that is the kind of thing that I really love learning about and finding and hearing about because it's so hard to say no when the state is in a position to authorize something that the industry is asking to do to themselves because they know it will help them grow. And that's the kind of stuff that is really cool to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think at the end of the day, as a legislator, I think that's what I mean, it's what you're trying to do, right? We're trying to improve people's lives on the daily, and I think when we're looking at a piece of legislation or putting a bill together, it's like, how can this positively impact the greatest swath of people to have a rippling effect, to have this, great, good thing happen for a lot of people? And I think if we are led from a place of that piece of humanity as a whole, I think we'd push forward, a lot better. Um, I think it'd be a lot better in general. But I think one thing we like to do here on a segment on here is we like to do a "You're Welcome to Politics" segment. So what I like to think about is you've been in the game for a while. So you've been in the game for a little while, and if you could just think back on your political career, what was the moment that was like, oh my gosh, this is politics? And it could be serious or funny, or it could be both. But it's that moment when you realize, like, holy moly, this is politics.
Gosh, that's so clear to me. Um, so, when I was first elected to the legislature, I was elected in a district that had been held by Republicans in the past, um, or that has been held by Republicans since then, and had been held by Democrats in the past. It's the 17th district, although it's very different from the district you live in because the footprint of it was quite different back then, and the
Yeah.
politics of our community were very quite different during that time. So it's not quite the same as it was. But during that time, when I won my election for that seat, it was in a recount by 140 votes. It was a seat that the Republicans were sure they were going to win and were very upset that they didn't. And so when I showed up in Olympia, like walked out of my 7th grade English and social studies class in December and into the Capitol building in January, completely new to the environment, just running on stuff that I cared about and thought I could help with. The minority leader at the time, in probably the first 2 weeks of session, came up to me on the floor and let me know that Um, I was just a huge target, and they were going to do everything they could to make sure I was not successful. And they did a bunch of nasty things. They sent pictures out to my district about with a picture of my empty desk when I wasn't sitting in it, saying that I was nowhere to be found. They played all kinds of mean tricks in Olympia, and like that was the first time I was like, oh, so my reward for working really hard to come do a job I think is really important, and to contribute in a space that is significantly the largest part of our state budget, K-12 education, and to do that from a space of professional expertise that I thought I could help. I'm rewarded with this welcome mat.
Wow. That is
But it wasn't
insane.
long, yeah, it wasn't long after that where, he and I started to figure out that we had a lot more in common, and worked a bit and talked a lot about rural issues that we shared in Cowlitz and Clark County and Lewis County. And, when he chose to leave the legislature and retire, I was very happy to stand up and on the floor and in my remarks tell this very same story, but also share how inspiring it is to know that you can have that as a starting place and then end up being strong partners in some issues.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. And that's it's unfortunate that those type of things have to happen, right? Because I think once the once the citizens speak, and that's who they've elected to be their representative, I think no matter what their beliefs are, what party they're from, I think they've earned the respect of that body from day one. And I hope that those type of things aren't happening still, but I'm sure it is. And that, it's a shame because if they're elected, that means the mass majority says this is the person we want to represent us. Then they should have the same amount of juice, the same amount of pull, the same amount of respect of everybody else who's been there for 2, 4, 6, 10, 12 years or whatever it is, because at the end of the day, it was always somebody's first day. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, I totally agree. And I feel like, at that moment, and probably, that it matured, this concept matured over time, but I just kind of adopted this philosophy of transparency. So now that I'm a member of House Democratic leadership and I'm in a position to deliver that very same type of message to somebody, instead I choose to approach it, the Monica Stonier way, which is to say, really love your support on this. I think it may be a problem for your caucus. I know you really like the idea and the concept, and I know you want to sign on. But you may want to check in with your own leadership first, because I don't want them to think that I'm playing dirty to come around and kind of cap. So I try to be very transparent with people so that if I do have sincere support for something, it shows up in the most meaningful way possible, because it's so much easier to burn a bridge than to build one. And I don't think anybody should do this job for a very long time because it's exhausting and hard. And so if
sure.
you're going to get real work done, then you're going to have to build more bridges than you burn in a short period of time.
Right. And I guess, as we work towards kind of closing out the podcast this episode, what advice would you have for young people, or anyone for that matter, that's kind of thinking about stepping into public service?
Um, well, I think maybe a version of what I just said, which is to know what you're about and to maybe come up with your own philosophical like top 3 rules that you are open to change as you learn more, but just to have kind of a personal compass that you'll follow because it's your way of doing things. It fits your own personal value set. It protects you from burning other people in a way maybe you've been burned in the past. And just kind of be open to having a compass that you're going to stick to because it's your own way. There's a lot of pressure to do things the way it's always been done, or because this is how we're going to get the votes or whatever. But I think knowing who you are is probably just as important in this job as it is in any other job that you could possibly have.
Yeah. And so, what do you want people to know about Representative Stonier as you go into this new session? What do you want people to keep an eye out for? How can they follow along what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly what I'm going to do is spend a lot of time with our members to help mitigate expectations about what we're going to be able to do when we don't have new revenue options. You know, we passed some revenue last time around, and I think we made significant progress where we felt like we could. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of time or capacity or tolerance for that type of session and that type of revenue again. So, you know, I'm going to just kind of be the person who walks around and tries to just remember the situation we're in and try to limit the number of bills that we're introducing, especially if they cost any money. I'm going to try to be a good example of that. I often don't follow my own advice when it comes to how you might want to limit the number of bills you introduce, but I do think that, you know, we have a role as lawmakers to introduce ideas that we want to work on down the road too. So there is some utility in introducing bills that you know you want to talk about later on, even if they're not feasible this year. But yeah, I mean, I think what I hope people will hear from me here at home when I'm in Olympia is that I'm doing my level best to protect people in this state who are negatively impacted by federal action, and to try and preserve as much as we can the investments we've made in this state for, you know, for access to healthcare, for K-12 education, for students, no matter how they come to us, to be supported in that space, for housing, and for those things that we've invested in across the board. We're going to have to do what we can to preserve what we've fought for in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Mark, I appreciate you coming on the show. We've talked about a ton of great stuff. I hope people enjoy the information, and we'll look to have you back on, you know, maybe mid-session if you can find a little time, or maybe at the end of session so we can talk about, you know, how that went for you.
Yeah, let's do it. I'll be ready.
All right.